All right, it is Libertarian Overwatch. It has been a minute. I am sorry. I've been kept busy these past few weeks, but we're still working really hard on the Substack, Libertarian Overwatch. But I decided we should come back and we should talk more about the writings of the one and only Justin Raimondo from antiwar.com. And today we're going to be covering Kyrgyzstan in the year 2005. So we have Kyrgyzstan's revolution. We also have ham-handed, and we have a revolution undone. So I will say, before I get too far into this, that I think Kyrgyzstan has been one of the most interesting revolutions that I've done research on so far. I did not expect it to be in the same category as a 2003 in Georgia or 2004 in Ukraine, but I think in some ways it kind of ranks up there along those other ones. And it's funny because I just finished the Iran 2009 one, and I imagine that one to be in the same echelon as some of those ones in terms of, overt kind of support and things like that. But honestly, in conclusion, through the research I've done on Iran, I would say that the influence that was exerted in Kyrgyzstan was actually significantly higher than it was in Iran in 2009. But anyways, let's check out what we got here from Justin. Now, I will say this first article, it really dives in a lot about the OSCE, about the elections and things like that. But there are a couple of very interesting things that I would like to point to. And this one is definitely one of the first ones that caught my eyes when we're talking about the government-owned printing plants that refuse to print opposition papers. So, to be very clear on this, this is kind of selling it short in a way. Because the full story about it, I want to say that this guy, cool guy right there, but yeah, this is one of my more recent articles for the Libertarian Institute, and this is kind of covering the role that the media has played a lot in some of these revolutions and things like that. And I will say, even after I finished my Kyrgyzstan article, I'm still finding new stuff about Kyrgyzstan. After Ukraine, I'm still finding out new stuff about Ukraine. That is definitely the case when it comes to the printing press, because as we go along here, we have... I'll just kind of read this paragraph here because I think if we're unfamiliar with this kind of case, it gives a good kind of backstory. But essentially, the 2005 Wall Street Journal article, which is really stellar and really gives a lot into the role Freedom House is playing in all of this, but also that documentary that I mentioned maybe every time I ever speak, the USA Conquest of the East, that French documentary, just so enlightening. But we see how we have that support for opposition media that Justin's kind of referring to with printing press and things like that. But especially about how we are even printing off the From Dictatorship to Democracy book, the one that's been called like the virtual Bible in these different revolutions and things like that. And also printing off opposition newspaper. I mean, this is someone from a U.S. NGO who's in Kyrgyzstan. And in the documentary, you can see they kind of even go like late at night. So that way they, I guess, can't find them, and things like that to run off these printing presses and things like that. I mean, I think they literally show up at 3 a.m. in the documentary. That hour might not be entirely right, but it was definitely very late in the night. But as we can see here, this is a news source that I just found recently about it, which I thought was very interesting. Like I said, I did not even find this before I wrote my Kyrgyzstan article. Granted, the research on my Kyrgyzstan article took me well over a day in terms of hours spent. So this is kind of what we got in hindsight and things like that. But one of the things I wanted to talk about is some of the quotes in here too, because I think this is interesting too. So even though we are providing the support for the printing press, even though we have people from the U.S. funded NGOs going there, here's some of the quotes we get about, what kind of quality they're getting a result from it. So with a very mediocre quality of print and a low standard of management, the independent press Freedom House presented us with an outstanding bill, higher than the state-run printing press. And showing how, it's not even competitive. So that was another little tidbit I wanted to add there. But yeah, and that's the newspaper, the MSN, which this is also the newspaper that kind of ran one of their, right on the front page, right before the election kind of takes place, where we have Akayev's, his home, and it looks like a mansion, and kind of contrasting that with, people who are starving, people who are really struggling at the time, because at the time, Kyrgyzstan is a very, very poor country. But yeah, Justin hit the nail on the head here, but I think we could have expanded this out a little bit. Granted, once again, this is some stuff that comes in hindsight. I mean, you got to remember, in these moments, Justin is writing it as soon as they're happening. For example, the protests that we saw in Iran at the start of 2026, if we were to talk about it right in the moment, we may not have a clear picture. But as a result, when Trump starts talking about how they're flooding in guns and things like that. I mean, the president himself is saying these things, so then you have the hindsight and go, oh, okay, I see what's happening here, But anyways, so that is something that I wanted to point out, is that printing press kind of component. I do think that is very important to point out. And then the next thing I want to point out here is, if we go down here, I know there's a couple other things I wanted to point out here too. But this part down here where they're talking about the Russian military airbase and things like that, that is also something that's important, worth discussing. The airbase that the U.S. was at was right after 9/11 happened, so they were using that airbase to kind of like patrol flights, to kind of keep the skies clear and things like that over in the area. And then yes, Russia opened up their own base nearby, and there's also how they would not allow the AWACS planes to be used at this airbase. So those are 2 points of kind of contention in the lead up to the revolution and things like that. I know there's one more thing I wanted to point out here too, because I think Justin hit the nail on the head and wrote it really, really good here. Where is it? I know it's here somewhere. But essentially, one of the biggest things that I think Justin's pointing to is a little bit of like the hypocrisy that we're seeing here. One example that we have, when we go further down here, is how we have accusations like this. So he even points to the vote buying, for example, and saying how we see that through subsidies, through steel, farm, tobacco, foreign aid, things like that. And I think it's good to point out that hypocrisy and things like that. And also, as I always phrase it, just kind of thinking about, on the shoes on the other foot, as they put it. If, for example, in the article I just shared for the Libertarian Institute, if someone from another country in the New York Times said during the 2016 election, oh, this is not fair, this is, democracy is really on the line right now, I think people would be a little bit outraged. They would say, why are you writing into our papers to tell us about how this election is going? And, that was the case in 2004 in Ukraine. John McCain from his office was writing into the Ukrainian Weekly, and he's saying, hey, this is not good for democracy. So I think perspective is a very important thing to have in some of these revolutions and things like that. And then I do want to go up to the top, because I think this is something that I do want to point out that is very, very important to point out. And I don't know if it's this one or it might be the next one, but essentially in one of these articles, Justin points out how this is a violent uprising. Instead of the concerts that you're seeing in Ukraine in 2004, or the stage shows, which I need to find what documentary I was watching, but it might be the one that was on the conflict resolution. I'll look it up. But essentially, it's and I think if you just search Orange Revolution, it's gonna be one of the first videos that pops up. But they actually have on stage, they have someone in an egg suit, and I took that to be kind of mocking the fact that Yanukovych got hit right in the chest, and they thought it was a battery or something like that. And then the local opposition channel showed, oh, it was an egg he got hit with, and there was like a camera that it was very Michael Scott Office filmed, where it went right to the egg and kind of zoomed in on it. So, we don't have those kind of things here. Here's what we have instead. And this is all from one of the local papers at the time. As you can see, this is March 26, 2005. Just look at these photos here. I mean, this is kind of what we're seeing here. And then this quote, I think, is very important too, where they say that it was surrendered almost without a fight. I mean, it was this very quick, very violent uprising. I think that picture just does the best kind of representation of it all, So let's go on to our next one. So that's our first article from Justin. Like I said, I really just like the way he kind of points to the framing. I think that was the most important part with that one. It was very focused on the election and the OSCE, but I think just taking it as, here is why there's hypocrisy here, I think is something that's very important, Now this one, ham-handed. I think this one's important because people who may even be generally familiar with the Kyrgyzstan story might not be familiar with like this particular component of it. So that's why I figured I would bring it up today. But what we're talking about here is a memo that was a alleged memo from the U.S. ambassador to Kyrgyzstan, Stephen Young, and that he says that it was like an obvious forgery and things like that. So I actually do have this memo. Now, this took a little bit to find, I will say. This probably took me maybe an hour just to find this one memo alone. But here is this quote-unquote secret report. And as we go down here, you even have the official kind of like letterhead and things like that. And so this was put around to like local buses and things like that, just all around Kyrgyzstan. So it says, as you can see right here, it is essential to increase the amount of financial support up to 30 million in promising opposition parties at the preliminary stage. And it mentions the National Democratic Institute, the IRI, Freedom House, Internews, Eurasia Foundation, and things like that, and how we want to intensify our influence in Central Asia. So the reason that I bring this up, and this is something I do in my long form kind of pieces on these things, is that I do think it's important to bring up, even if something is reported as maybe this is just alleged and things like that. And I make sure to say it. I don't just go out and say, hey, here's a false story and it's totally true. I do the research on it, and, to this one in particular, in my article, I make sure to note that the U.S. Embassy, they quickly announced this document. They called it a crude forgery, and they said it falsely used that official letterhead and Young's signature. And the U.S. also called on the Kyrgyz leaders to reject the memo. But this is why I included it in my article, because still to this day, Akayev is still saying, hey, remember that time that the U.S. said they were sending 30 million to these organizations? Framing is something I think is very important, very, very important. These stories, while they may seem false, and to be honest with this one, I have not come to heads or tails on this one. I'm going to be completely honest with you. It could be entirely false. It could be entirely true. I would not be surprised either way. Is it kind of on the nose? Yes. Were people aware at the time that these organizations were doing things like that, especially after Georgia and Ukraine? And could they have easily done this? Absolutely. But the point is, Akayev still thinks this is a real memo here. And like I said, we're talking as recent as the late 2010s, maybe even the early 2020s from some of the interviews I was seeing with him. And he still very much so believes like this did happen. Like I said, I think that framing is really important. Even when I was doing the Iran article, there were a lot of articles and headings I took from Press TV. And it's not me to say, hey, this is totally right, but it's saying this is the perception at the time, And one of them was even that the protester in the streets in Iran was killed by CIA. I don't think that was the case at all. But those kind of framings, I think, are something that's very important. Or how Iran was continuously blaming British and American influences and the specific claims they had. Because I think if you just present it as one side and you don't present what the others were saying, I think that's something that, makes it's an incomplete story at that point. You could say that in some of these revolutions that there wasn't much influence from the U.S. side. But to make that case, let's think about what the opposition is saying too, kind of build out the full case and things like that. Like I said, in Kyrgyzstan, I definitely think there was a lot of influence put behind by the United States. Am I saying that this was all orchestrated and puppeteered by the U.S.? No, not necessarily, but there were definitely influences in it. And like I said, more than is seen later in Iran in 2009 and things like that. So that is the memo. And we'll get to our last article by Justin here. Now this one is, I think this one's another important one because this is kind of seeing it in retrospect. Now, in some of the documentaries and things like that, where they're talking about it, the NGOs who were, or the people in these NGOs who were very excited for this revolution to happen, they meet up with them after the revolutions happen. And they say, has anything changed? And they're essentially saying, no, like we're still poor. No, we're still struggling. And in fact, there is another revolution in Kyrgyzstan by the end of the decade, or start of the decade, so in 2010. So I mean, this is just 5 years after this one, and a lot of those same things continue to happen. And also, once again, it becomes violent once again in 2010. So and that's the other unfortunate thing that I really try to convey a lot in my writings, and is that even when there is hope for a different leader and things like that, the evil that you do know compared to the evil that you don't know, we never know who's getting installed in some of these countries and things like that. Those corruption, the poor economy, working for foreign interests in terms of like economic deals and things like that. Georgia, I'm thinking in particular in that case, where we're talking about, the relationship they have with Russia and Russian energy and things like that. So that's one of the biggest things I want to mention when it comes to Kyrgyzstan too, is like I said, we see that revolution that quick. Just 5 years later, we see, the second Tulip Revolution and things like that. The one thing that isn't explored too much in Justin's writing here, like I said, I really do like how we capture, like these are very, very strong articles by Justin. The one thing we don't capture quite so much is the youth groups at the time. So there was two. There was Kel and there was Burge. I believe I'm pronouncing this correctly. And I think their story is very important too. These youth groups were really helping out in the streets when there was like the looting and rioting and things like that. And in fact, one of them was actually hacked. That they made like a pro-government version of the organization, and were saying they were doing all these events. You know, they were giving lemons to ladies at the nursing home and things like that. Which I would love to know if that actually happened. If so, that's hilarious, because I just imagine some grandma going, "What is this lemon doing here?" But I think this is a very important story that Kel and Burge is very much so based off of the Serbia Otpor lineage. As you can see in the documentary, USA Conquest of the East, you can see them kind of talking about it. And not only that, you can see them sitting around a laptop and they're all kind of watching it. And their color scheme is also the black and white of Otpor, and very similar kind of stylistic choices that they go for there. So I do wish we explored that a little bit here. Some of that was at the time, but also, I mean, you got to think about how many blogs and stuff were around this time. I mean, when I was doing like my Denim Revolution kind of article and things like that, just going through the WordPresses of the world and things like that, it's like, man. And then you try to go through the NGOs, through the NDI, through the IRI, through all these organizations, and all this is on Internet Archive. Man, it'll make your head spin. And for someone who's writing basically every day, I know back in the early 2000s, he was writing 3 times a week, Justin was. And these are very long articles. This is not some basically, you know, a few short blurbs. Most of those articles were really long. So I don't necessarily fault him for, you know, not getting on the Kel and Burge kind of stories and things like that. I think for the time that it was done and for the way he writes it, especially that first article I showed today, the classic Justin wit is just present throughout, and it's really stellar. So that is essentially the Kyrgyzstan Revolution, the 2005 Tulip Revolution. If you enjoyed this, please subscribe, please share it. Like I said, I have just finished. This is June 30th that I'm recording this. I don't know if I'm going to upload this tonight. If I'm going to upload it tomorrow, we'll see on that. But I just did a 10,000 plus word Iran Green Revolution article. It drove me a little nuts. Took a lot of time. I've been reaching out to see if I can land an interview with anyone. If you haven't checked out, I did get an interview for the 2008 movement in Egypt. And I thought that was a very interesting kind of conversation. In my interviews, I do like to just let the guests kind of speak, but I also like to have, you know, very specific kind of questions and things like that to talk about their framing in certain articles and things like that. Like, hey, when you mentioned this, tell me a little bit more about that. What was your experience and things like that? And I really hope that I'll be able to get some of that for Iran. I know I have someone who said they would love to, and that we might try to link again later in the summer. So hopefully that works out well, because this has been quite the writing experience. Like I said, I was really just making sure I got everything dotted out, got it all lined out and things like that. So please subscribe to the Substack. Consider becoming a paid subscriber. For that paid subscription is $5 a month, and you are getting these long form pieces. I mean, you can't really see it if you're just the free subscriber, because I throw that paywall in after a little bit, but we're talking long form pieces. I mean, I think that for the Iran one, each piece is between 20 to 25 minutes of reading time. So you're getting, you know, nearly an hour worth of reading material regarding Iran, and very, very heavily sourced too. I have hyperlinks for every single claim I have in there, every framing, all of that. And the important parts I have screenshots of too, to say like, hey, this is where this is coming from. For example, I have like the Journal of Democracy. I have that as one of the things that's in there. Boom. Here's like exactly what was said there. So that way, you know, this is factual, because when I'm doing these articles, you know, there have been times where I've had to go back and go, okay, actually that connection is not quite right. Or that was, I remember it was very early on. It might have been Serbia. It might have been the Philippines, Madagascar, somewhere in that early 2000s. I remember that the initial source I found, it was actually the wrong politician. So then when I was able to find the right name, I was even able to find the video clip of like what he was saying on the stand and things like that. I was like, oh, perfect. So before I submit these things, I am reading them. I'm proofreading them before I go to bed tonight. I'm going to be rereading that Iran one, part 1, making sure it's all good for you guys. it's a long way of saying I'm really enjoying this work. I'm hoping you guys are as well. And please share this to whoever you think would be interested in it. All right. Have a good one.